Well, a captain of a warship was sailing along. It was nighttime, and he happened to see a light in the distance, and he decided to send a signal, with the signal light. And so the signal was change course. And a few minutes later, a light came back. It said, you change course. And he thought about it for a moment, and he could feel that energy kind of show up, and he flashed another signal out there that said, we are a battleship, you change course. And a few more minutes went by, and all of a sudden the light flashed back and said, you change course. We're a lighthouse. You probably heard that little vignette before. Okay? But what kind of came up for me around that was, when we are standing on solid ground, we have the upper hand. Right? When we're standing on whatever solid ground exists, we sort of call the shots, we sort of put forth the energy. And it's interesting that in the context of our values and our work that we do, the question is, what is the solid ground, and how do we use that to deal with the battleships in our life? We all have battleships that show up in our life, right? We all have things that are coming at us. We all have arrogant captains that seem to think that they know what's best, that they would like to direct the course, that they would like to tell us what it is that we should do or not do. I'm sure that some of you have probably experienced that once in a while in your life experience, whether it's at work or whether it's in your growing up years or whatever it is as a student. We all have these things that come at us. And they send us signals to change course. That it's kind of the shoulds of life. You should do this. If you'd just do this, you'd be happy. I don't understand why you're so unhappy. Why don't you just kind of do this? And those are kind of the shoulds that show up out of the warships of our life. And that language is really the language of what we know in our spiritual life as the ego. That in Unity we call that the personality. But however we might characterize it, it's that part of us that relates to the outer world. It's that part of us that lives through the five senses, that takes its information, takes its messaging, takes its direction, takes whatever it needs to take through our experience of the world. And it looks around us. Whenever we have a question, we're trying to answer something in our life or deal with something in our life, we look around us for advice or direction. And it's not that it's inappropriate to take information in about things that we need to do. It's that what ground are we standing on that allows us to take that information and know how to deal with it in a way which is proper and appropriate. Metaphysically, the ego thinks it's in charge of our life. It thinks it knows what's best. And our spiritual work, I think a lot of the spiritual work that we have to do in our life is somehow finding a way to kind of change that relationship. To not let go of the ego, but to let go of the need for the ego to control whatever it is it needs to control. The ego is important. It's an important part of how we interact and live and relate in the world. The question is, where is the ego getting its guidance? Where is it placed in the context of our experience in our life? Because it's essential to function, the ego is essential for us to function in our human reality, and as we understand, we are both spiritual and human beings. We're not one or the other, that we're both. And so if we're both, then we need to create the appropriate balance and understanding in our life. So I think the ego at its worst is like a out-of-control pit bull. And the ego at its best is a servant of the divine. And so I think most of us are probably somewhere in that range. We probably slide along back and forth one direction or the other depending on what's going on in our life or how we might get pulled or sucked into the experience. I think the best example of looking at ego might lie in the area of politics. I don't know how many of you get involved in political experiences or get kind of pulled into some of the dynamics, and you read the newspaper and all the arguments about this and what we should do here and what we should do that. And if you notice, all the solutions to everything come from sort of rearranging the deck chairs of our experience, right? That all the solutions sort of live out here. That it's like we're going to do this or that or this or change this or go here or spend more money here or less money here or whatever. It's all about kind of moving things around and moving the pieces of the puzzle in a way that's different. Now, that's not necessarily inappropriate, but it just seems to be wherever all the energy is focused and all the dynamics exist. And you hear lines like fighting, we need to fight fire with fire, as though that's useful. So if we have violence, what do? We respond with violence, okay? Or I like keep your friends close and your enemies closer, And what does that presume? It presumes that we have enemies, right? And so we need to keep them close. And so if we presume we have enemies, then we have enemies because our ego creates that sense of separation that creates that person or persons or experience that shows up as our adversary or our enemy, what we might call our enemy. And so the question is always for me, it's like, the forming principle of our country, the intention of this country is what? Freedom, right? Freedom is sort of the organizing intention of what shows up in our country. And we created freedom in our country by rebelling. Right? Because there was all this oppression that was going on. There was somebody from across the sea, a monarch, who was telling us what we could and couldn't do and imposing laws and rules that weren't appropriate, that were nonsensical, that didn't make sense in terms of responsibility. And so out of that came a sense that, okay, freedom. And so we achieve freedom through war. And so what we did is we created a sense of, okay, it's okay to bring freedom through violence. Well, when we look back on it, we're all glad we did, right? You look back and say, yes, that was appropriate. And at that time and place, that dynamic probably was necessary in order to do what needed to be done. Although if you think about the sacrifice that went along with that, the human cost that occurred about that, we don't have a relationship to that or an understanding around that. But if you kind of move the clock further forward and you look at this whole dynamic from a different point of view and you say, maybe there are other ways that we're not discounting that, but maybe there are other ways of bringing something into our experience other than through violence. That maybe Gandhi may have had an idea that worked, that maybe he brought something into the experience that said, gosh, there's a way you can achieve freedom without picking up a rifle, or without loading a gun, or maybe there's a way of doing that. And just maybe that's what Jesus was talking about. Maybe Jesus was saying, when Peter cut the ear off of the guard that captured Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and put his hand on Peter's arm and he said, no. Because he who lives by the sword dies by the sword. And he was stating a principle. And so maybe what our job is to do is to find the principles that we can stand on that come out of our spiritual values. Maybe the solid ground that we're looking for isn't the behaviors that show up, but rather the principles that show up in the dynamic of our reality, our spiritual life, so that we might be able to make decisions about how to show up and respond in the world from a solid place of understanding about who we are and how these things might show up in our life. Now, I'm talking about it in a big picture, in the consciousness of nation building, but it's true in our individual lives as well, that if we hope to achieve something, if our neighbor puts his fence on across our property line, okay, and we go over and get into a big argument with them, and we get an attorney, and we go to court, and what have we done? We have created an adversarial dynamic. And even though it's the neighbor's fault,